Hi everyone, Brittany here with the Photo Physician. Today I'm going to show you how to perform a face swap in Photoshop in just 8 easy steps. So the first step that we're going to do is you're going to open both of your photos in Photoshop at the same time. So your first photo is going to be your base layer. That's the one that has somebody not looking at the camera or blinking or crying or frowning or whatever. That's the photo where everyone looks good except for that one person or the few people that you want to swap. That will be your base layer. The other photo you're going to open is the one with the face that you want to use. So you're going to open both of these at the same time. That's step one. So step two is the first thing that I always do when starting any Photoshop project. I always duplicate the background layer. So since this is going to be our base photo, we're going to do it over here. So I'm on Windows, so I hit Ctrl J on the keyboard. If you're on Mac, you're going to hit Command J, and that duplicates the background layer. Now the reason I do this is because it makes sure that if I ever accidentally make a change like cloning or anything to the background layer, I always have a clear background that I can fall back on, so none of those changes are permanent. So that's why I always duplicate the background layer before starting. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over to the face that we want, and we are going to cut it out. Now, I use the rectangular marquee for this, so I'm going to explain why I do this instead of pulling the entire photo over or using a mask. We'll use a mask later. But to start, we're going to use the rectangular marquee. So you'll notice that if you took the entire photo and put it here, then you needed to do any aligning or anything. Say that you are zoomed in here and you're wanting to align these two faces so that they are perfectly on top of each other. You'll notice that, okay, say they're taken from different distances and you need to do some scaling. You can't reach your transform tools, your scaling, because it's off the screen. So you have to scroll to go get it, and then you can't see what you're doing. So in order to see both at the same time, I prefer to cut out just the face that I need and as much of the rest of the photo as I might need so that I can have those transform tools easily accessible. So in this instance, I can see that the sky is clear, so there's not going to be anything there that I might need. But there's a chance that I might need his arm or maybe even part of her. So I'm going to grab this whole section and I'm going to hit Ctrl J on Windows or Command J on Mac to be able to make a new layer from that selection. Then after I've done that, I'm going to click on that and drag it to my other photo. So now, if I need to scale or make adjustments, I can see those transform tools right there handy, and I don't have to go scrolling to look for them. So that is the next thing we're going to do, is we're going to scale and align. So in this instance, you can see that his eyes are really not close to lining up very well. But when you think about it, there's not really any part of him that you need except for his face. It's pretty isolated. The background is pretty blurry behind him. So we can just replace his entire head from the neck up. So in that case, I would rotate it so that his shoulders and his jacket align. So I want to make sure that that white collar of his shirt, and I'm using the arrow keys on my keyboard to be able to make these tiny little nudge adjustments to get it in just the right place. And so I'm going to nudge him until it aligns. Now you can see that this other shoulder is not aligning, but I think that will be okay. And we can address that later if we need to. Maybe make it a tad bit bigger. We'll want to do all of our aligning now to get as close as we can. But So the face does not need to align, but I'm just aligning this part here so I can tell that he is the same size in both photos. So I think I've got that pretty close. So I'm going to hit the check mark or hit enter on the keyboard to confirm those changes. So the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to make a mask. Now you have two options when masking. You can make a white mask, which would let you remove everything that you don't want from the layer, or you can make a black mask that would show you just what you do want. So a lot of times in face swaps, I prefer to use a black mask because if you use a white one, then that means that you have to paint off everywhere that you don't want it. Well, if you miss anything, you may find that there are little pieces of that layer that you missed, and now those are haunting you in different parts of the photo. And so if you use a black mask, you really, it just opens you up to a lot less problems later on. So I'm going to hit this rectangle with a circle in it. It says add layer mask down the bottom right corner. I'm going to click that. And in order to make it a black mask, I'm going to invert it. So I'm going to hit Ctrl I on the keyboard or Command I if you're on Mac. Now, you'll see that completely got rid of it. That's exactly what I want. I've already got them aligned. So I know that all I have to do is hit B on my keyboard to pull up my brush tool, or I could go click it over here. And once I've got that open, you see I'm making my brush bigger because this is not going to be a super precise thing at this step. Since I'm using a black mask, I'm going to use a white brush, and I'm going to brush over his face to bring that back. Now you can see I've still got partial transparency, so that's why it's looking wonky. So now that I turn my opacity back up to 100%, because you're going to, in order to have to scale and align, you have to adjust your opacity down to 50% or so that you're able to see both layers at the same time and make sure that they line up. Once you're done with that, you'll want to set it back at 100%. And you can see that it looks good. He has the correct face, but you can see those harsh edges around him. So in this instance, this background has a lot of blur, so it's pretty easy to change. Now, you see when I start to go this direction with it, then that starts affecting her and moving her head down. Well, I don't want to give her a smaller forehead. I want to keep that the way it was. So the way I would do this is I would keep clicking, and if I want to make sure that it's exact, I can turn off those background layers so I can see just him. And I can go in over here with a fairly hard brush. Not super hard, not super soft. And I can use my mask tool with white to add back content and black to remove. And I can click in around his face to get that more precise. Now you can see that there were some parts of his hair that I cut off a little bit. So if I want to make that a little better transition, I can use a 0% hardness brush to be able to do the hair a little better. And then I can just kind of go around and obviously don't use that big of a brush. You can see kind of going around his face. I can make it a little harder if I want it to be more precise. In fact, I can show you how to be really precise. You can totally zoom in and just really concentrate on removing all those places where you can see that it's the wrong color. But you can also see that part of the checkerboard pattern is showing up on his cheek here. And there's some times where I may end up needing part of it to be like that, but I haven't seen that to be the case in this situation. So I'm going to keep doing this and removing that. Now, we haven't decided what to do with his collar yet, so I need to show those layers again so I can see what I'm dealing with. Now you can see that once I've done that, you can see this side of his face is now visible. It's duplicated. Now, it's kind of confusing because of the way his head is turned, but you can see that his eyes and everything, the right size, but it's looking confusing because, or it's duplicated because his head is turning. So he was in more of this side profile. So to look at the camera now, there's this part that's showing over here. So now we have to clone out any of the original face that's still visible. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on a background layer, and we're going to hit the plus so that we make a layer that is under the correct face layer. We're going to go over here to our clone tool. Now, I want this to be set for current and below. In this case, if you hid the top face, then you could set it for all layers. But, so you can do it either way, which may be easier. So just make sure that you have it set for the correct settings based on whether your layer is visible or not. So because you can see how this background is blurry and abstract enough, I should be able to remove that pretty easily. So I'm going to go in here. Probably want a little softer of a brush. And I'm going to clone out this area here that was being duplicated. Now it doesn't matter how that looks, because it'll look funny, but that's because our correct face is not showing through. So we can pull that layer back up every so often and check and see. We can also see that there is a little place here where you could see a little green behind his ear. So we'll make our brush super tiny so I can remove that. And then I'm going to go in and just refine that edge around his ear. Just make sure that none of it has gotten lost. And then fix this little side of his forehead that was getting lost a little bit. And you can see that those colors get a little more vibrant. Like you can tell part of it had been lost to transparency and then it's coming back. So it's good to go over it a few times and make sure that you're catching all of those things. So let's see. Now, if you're saying, well, how do I know exactly where his original, the side of his head, was originally, so that I can make sure to get that edge just perfect? You can always turn on this, you could always go back to a white brush and put that back, because you can see that I lost that hair on the side of his head, and that's why it was looking so unnatural. So it's always good to kind of go back and forth between the black and white brush so that you can make sure that everything is correct. So you can see I've kind of got layers from two parts of his hair here. So both photos are shining through. You kind of want to blend those together because that part was coming through from the other one, but that's okay. So we're going to make sure that that all kind of blends in. And let's see, maybe give that a little chop and kind of get rid of this, consider that more of a flyaway there. And let's see. So there we go. I see a little spot on his ear. We could kind of do a little bit of that to kind of blend that in. And all that's doing is showing that background where it was cloned. You can always go back and fix that if you see that there's places where cloning has some issues or whatever. You can always go back onto that empty layer with that clone layer and fix those. That's why I prefer to do my cloning on a separate empty layer and set it for current and below or all layers instead of just current layer. Because that way these changes can be made at any time. So you could use the eraser tool or my preference, a mask. If, for instance, I went too far and I covered part of his face, let's say I do that. So say I clone too much, like let's say this layer was on top, but you know, if for some reason you find yourself, like for instance, I clone over on top of her head and then I want to redo that. What I'd be able to do is to mask that off because it's an empty layer. Now, if I hadn't duplicated my background, or if I hadn't, you know, if I was making those changes to the original background and accidentally cloned something wrong, I would be stuck with those changes. So that's why I do all these precautions of making duplicate layers and doing things with mask and starting with an empty layer to try to prevent any problems that I might have by making changes that I don't like and then going too far past edit undo. And finally, you're going to want to make sure that you remove any parts of the clothing that may not be aligned anymore. So you can see that if I click on and off of him, you can see that there is this area that still needs to be fixed on his collar. So I would go through and make sure to remove all of that. And you see when I go too strong, then his neck starts to come too far in, which doesn't match. So you'll make sure to do it something like that. A lot of times face swaps kind of open up a can of worms because each time you click, you kind of add more places that need to be fixed. And that's just kind of part of it, is knowing when to stop. Now, say your photos aren't as similar to these, and there's a little different white balance or sharpness between the two photos. What you'll want to make sure that you blend those. So one thing that I typically do, if say the face that I was bringing in for him did not match in the white balance, I would use a photo filter. So say he had more of a bluish tint in the photo that I was bringing and I wanted to match his original skin tone. So you can always refer back to the original to see what color it should have. So I would go over here to photo filter and I would click through these until I find one where that color matches his original skin tone. Then the other thing is you want to make sure that the sharpness and noise matches. Now, typically it's frustrating to add noise to a photo, but it can make your face swap look unnatural if one photo has noise and the other doesn't. And you can always just use Topaz over the final image. Say she was completely different sharpness than him because I was maybe bringing in a face where he was smiling and looking, but he was a little blurry. I would run Topaz, Photo AI, or Sharpen over the entire photo, and then that would equal out to make both of their faces the same amount of sharp or noise reduced. So that is just another thing that you would want to do. So that's your final step to make sure that things are blended, is to make sure that the color balance and the sharpness and amount of noise match between your two photos. And that is how you do a face swap. Let me know if that helped you and if you have any questions. See you next time.